Well, good morning, church. I'm so proud of you for being here this morning. And it's cold, it's windy, it's not very nice outside, but you're here. And I think God has something for us this morning. I read an article from Christianity Today, and it was about Jenny. Jenny was 92 whenever she passed away. But for most of her life, she told and retold a story over and over about a time when her sister would not give her $1. She needed one more dollar, and her sister would not give it to her for the shoes that she needed to buy. And she retold this story for most of her life, and she had memorized every detail of it. And every detail that she told, you thought that she had just experienced this just a few days ago. And every time she told it, she would relive and re-enter the hurt that she had. And it was apparent that she was not going to forgive her sister for not giving her that dollar decades ago. Bitterness, it may or it may not start small in our life. But every single time, bitterness will grow if we don't get rid of it. And you know how we do with this. We enlist the support. Every time we tell about our hurt or our injury, we enlist the support and try to get everybody on our side, right? But it just grows our resentment even more. Every time we tell the story, we assume that the offense was intentional, don't we? We always assume the worst in people and think that they meant to do what they did and they had reason for doing what they did. And we look for other reasons, real or imagined, to dislike the villain in our life. We think that's not probably the only thing wrong that they've ever done. In fact, there's other reasons we should probably dislike them. And we fool ourselves into thinking that we don't really care what they think about us, right? But the opposite is true, and our anger and our resentment have a way into spreading into everything in our lives. You see, bitterness is a lot like a beach ball. And try as you may, but you put that thing beneath the surface of the water and you hold it down for as long as you can. But eventually what happens? It pops up, and when it pops up, it splashes everybody around us. Bitterness is a lot like that. We've all been there. Every single one of us knows what I'm talking about this morning. We've all been bitter about something. And we may still be bitter about something in our lives even today. I mean, how many of us have had imaginary conversations in the bathroom or while driving to work or while mowing the lawn, right? You know what I'm talking about. And those conversations always usually go really well for us. We give them an imaginary piece of our mind. Meanwhile, the bathroom is now all fogged over and our mowing lines are pretty whack. Martin Luther King Jr., he called this the temptation of bitterness. And he said that it visits us all. And when he said that bitterness is corrosive to the soul, he was right. Joyce Meyer used similar language when she said this: it's like drinking poison and hoping that your enemy dies. And we're starting a series, like Ryan said, called Curveball. And it's the story of Joseph. And it's one of the incredible stories in all the Bible. And we call it Curveball because Joseph had several curveballs thrown to him in his life. And how he dealt with every single one of those curveballs, we can learn something from. And the story of Joseph, it answers the question of what do you do when bitterness is gripping you? What do you do when bitterness is gripping you? And it all started with a jealousy of relationship. If you got your Bibles, I want you to open them up with me to Genesis chapter 37. Genesis chapter 37 starts this story with Joseph. He's a young man here, and he has 11 brothers, and they are going to be jealous of his relationship with his father. So look at Genesis chapter 37, and let's read verse 3 and 4. It says this: Now Israel loved Joseph more. Who's Israel? Israel is just another name for Isaac. Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. And so Jacob is the grandson of Abraham. Okay, so they called him Israel too, right? So this is Jacob. So it says that now Israel, or Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he had made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Favoritism, right? Favoritism on your kids. Jacob or Israel, he gets the Father of the Year award, doesn't he? We're not probably going to invite him to speak to us about any parenting seminars anytime soon. And he's not the only one to do this. I don't know if you guys have heard that Deion Sanders is quite famous for ranking his children and then letting his children know where they are in the rank. My daughter's smiling because we do that at home as well. I don't know if you guys have seen the clip of the grandson of the who has a grandmother that ranks her grandchildren. Check this out.
So this is my grandma's ranking board. She has a wooden board where she ranks the 10 grandchildren from 1 to 10. All of our faces are on magnets. I'm number 4. This is the highest I've ever been. I did just get 2 new tattoos though, so I'm a bit nervous about what that's going to do for my ranking. What do you think of my new tattoos, Danny?
This is what I think of your new tattoos.
Favoritism, it just doesn't help anybody. And Jacob, of all people, should have known. He should have known. Of all people, he should have known what favoritism does, because his own father did it to him. He had a brother named Esau, and his dad favored Esau, and it created a huge rift in the family. In Genesis 25:28, it says, Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Esau was a man's man. He loved to hunt. He loved to do all the manly things. And Jacob apparently was more of a homebody and kind of a mama's boy. And Isaac, his father, struggled with that. And so it says that he loved him more. And instead of, you know how we do with our parents' mistakes, we try to correct those for our children. But he didn't do that. He didn't correct that for his children. He copied and pasted right into his own family's lives. Every set of kids in a family seem to agree on who the favorite child is, though, don't they? Right? If I ask you who's the favorite in your family when you were growing up, who would you say was the favorite? Right? You probably have a consensus. My younger sister called me the golden child of the family. That I was the golden child. She's not wrong. I think they got that one right. But Jacob obviously favored his son Joseph, and his brothers became jealous of that relationship. And understandably so. And this is key. This is key. That was not their fault. They didn't do anything. That happened to them. Because every child wants to know that they're special in their father's eyes. And right there in that moment, in those 2 verses, the seed is planted. That seed of bitterness is planted in that soil. And then it led to a jealousy of not just relationship, but it escalated from there into a jealousy of position. Looking back in verse 3, it says this, Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. Now that's just not some robe that he thought, I'm going to make him a robe, and he started knitting a robe together. No, that's not what it was. This was a title. These robes were full-length robes with sleeves, and those were not worn by laborers, those were worn by management. Now think about that, guys. I don't know how many of you guys are business owners, but you take your youngest son, the one you favor, and make him the boss of your older sons. That's probably not going to work out too well for your business. Well, it didn't work out well for them either. And that's what happens. Now, there's a backstory here. There's more to the story. As Paul Harvey would say, there's a rest to the story here, right? See, the oldest child, Reuben, had messed up earlier in the story. In Genesis chapter 35, verse 22, his oldest son, Reuben, he laid with one of his concubines, with his father's concubine. If you think your family's dysfunctional, if you think your family's messed up, just read some of this and you'll be thinking that your family is just quite okay. When Jacob found out what his son had done, he stripped him of his birthright, which was a double portion of the inheritance and the leader of the family. And he took that away from him. But he didn't. Here's where it got weird. Who do you give that to? The next man up, right? And that was Simeon. Simeon was the next oldest child, but he didn't do that. He kept it, and then he waited, and then whenever he had Joseph, he loved him. And so he gave it to Joseph. And he skipped all those other sons, and he gave it to Joseph. And he signified it with giving him this special relationship, signified by this robe and a new position as manager of his brothers, with this, again, signified by this robe. And we have to watch out for this, because this kind of jealousy can happen in our lives too. The type of jealousy because of somebody else's position. Maybe your boss favors somebody else at your workplace, right? Maybe your coach seems to favor someone else less talented on the team. One of your kids might favor your spouse. Maybe one of your other in-laws has a better relationship with your in-laws than you do. When someone gets promoted, but you are skipped over, even though you got more time with the company, you feel like you're more skilled, but it happened anyway. And that jealousy can creep up in our hearts. And it's not the only type here. There can also be the jealousy of blessing. We're going to see this in the story too. The jealousy, not only the jealousy of relationship, but the jealousy of position. But now it's getting deeper. Now we're going to see a jealousy of his blessing. Look in chapter 37, verse 5. Follow me there. It says, Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. And he said to them, listen to this dream that I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose up and stood up, right, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it, right? Listen, dude, first of all, nobody cares about your dreams like you do. You ever notice that? You wake up and you say, man, I had this crazy dream. Nobody cares, right? You care a lot, and you, for some reason, want to tell the dream, but really nobody wants to know, right? He shouldn't have told the dream, especially because of what happened in the dream. Like, yeah, I'm cool, you're not. You bow down and worship me in this dream. What do you think about that, right? Yeah, we don't care in the first place. Now we hate you even more, right? Look at what happens. His brother said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he said. But you know, some of us, we don't take hints very well, do we? And Joseph just doubles down on this thing. Look at the next verse. He says, then he had another dream. And he told it to his brothers. See, that's where he went wrong. It's fine to have another dream. If you're having, you can control that. You got another dream from God, fine, that's fine. Just don't tell it to him. But he does. And look what he says. He says, listen, he said, I had another dream. And this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars are bowing down to me, right? It's obvious. The sun and the moon are his father and his mother. And the 11 stars are his brothers, right? He knows what he's doing by telling them. He should have never done that. But they have a choice in how they react to that. This dream seems to be from God. And it infuriated the brothers. Not only is he being favored by his dad, but now he's being favored by God. We have to watch out for this type of jealousy in our lives too. Because this can happen. You ever got upset when some things just seem to go right for other people, but you are hitting setback after setback? You know what I'm talking about? It can feel a lot like God favors other people, but that He's kind of forgotten about you. And it's worse if you are generally like what you would consider a good person and they're a real jerk. And yet God still seems to bless them in their life. Jealousy of Jacob's relationship, his position, and now his blessing. All that comes together to form this like jealousy and this bitterness brew that forms in their hearts. And it's at this moment right here that they have a choice in what to do. I mean, we have all experienced it in our lives. Every single one of us has been jealous of something or bitter about something, and we all have that moment where we have to decide, what are we going to do with it? God gives us that moment every single time. What are we going to do with it? And so they decide. Skip on down to verse 14 in chapter 37. In verse 14 it said, so he said to him, who's he? He is Jacob, said to Joseph. He said, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. What's he doing? He's sending the manager to go. He's not saying don't go work with your brothers. He wasn't working with them in the beginning. And then he's saying, hey, don't go help them. I'm sure they need help. Go do some work with them. He said, no, go check in on them. And then report back to me. If they're doing anything wrong, let me know. He's just setting his son up for failure here, you know. And so he says he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When he sent him off, that's 60 miles away, okay? So it's going to take him 3 or 4 days to get there, right? And it says, when Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering in the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? Now that's interesting. A man found him. I don't know if you knew this, but in Genesis, if there's an unidentified man here, it's almost always an angel, okay? Now, this could or could not be an angel. We're not told, but in keeping with the other instances, if it is an angel, it's interesting because this angel says, oh, they're not here, and he sends him to his brothers. If it's an angel, why? The question begs itself. They know what's going to happen to Joseph. These guys are going to plot to kill him. Why would God send him to that? Why would God do that? Send him into this pain? Why would He allow that? And even play a role into guiding his feet into that? This is a key understanding for the entire story. We have to understand this. And I think God wants us to understand this. And if you understand it, to be reminded of it. Even when you don't understand what's happening or why, and you're going through hard times, God is working in the background for your good. Now, you're going to say, it was not for His good. It was not for His good. And so we got to break a rule here, okay? We got to break a rule. I don't know how many of you guys are like big book readers, but we're going to break a rule. We're going to go to the end of the story. Even though we're not through the story, we're going to go to the end of the story. And the end of the story is in Genesis chapter 50. And in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, he says this, you intended to harm me. This is Joseph speaking to his brothers at the end of it all. He says, you intended to harm me. But God, all right? But God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. God would use this story in an incredible way. He would use Joseph through the pain in an incredible way for something even bigger than just his comfort, for something even bigger than just his glory. He was going to use this to save lives, many, many lives. Listen, if you are hurting, or if you are suffering, or if you're going through it, if life has thrown you a curveball, it does not mean that God doesn't love you. What it means is that God is using you. He is working a story through your pain. And if, there's a big if there, I admit, if you will stay faithful, and do what is right in your hardship. God has promised to do a great work through your story. And then in verse 17 in Genesis chapter 37, here's what happens. He says, they have moved on from here. The man answered, I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance. And before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. How did they see him? What gave him away? The coat. Isn't it ironic that the coat gave him away and it led to his demise? And they said, let's kill him. Now, that kind of conversation doesn't happen all the time, with your brothers. Maybe it did, I don't know. But it usually starts out with kind of a half joke. That guy, we'd be better off without that guy. And then what does one of the other brothers say? No, yeah, for real. Like, he should be dead. And everybody's like, oh, come on, man. Come on. It's like, well, you think about it. Look at him, how he's walking with that coat on, just so arrogantly, and it just builds from there. And that's what bitterness does, doesn't it? It can start out small, but it can grow into something so massive. And it can make us go down paths we never thought that we would ever go down. It would make us say things that we would never say otherwise. And it takes our joy and it just rips it out of our hearts, and it turns us into people that we never meant to become. And that's what bitterness, that's not you. That's not them. That's the bitterness in them speaking. And it's the bitterness in us when we choose to let that fester in our lives. Verse 23, it says this, so when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe. Isn't that interesting? The very first thing is they strip him of this robe. Why? That was a flag to their hurt and their pain. And the first thing they do is strip that thing off of him. And they took him and they threw him in the cistern. The cistern was empty and there was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. The camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. And what they wound up doing is saying, well, let's not kill him. We don't want his blood on our hands. In fact, let's take this opportunity and let's just sell him to those guys. And they take that robe, because obviously his father's going to be asking questions, where's Joseph? And they put blood on it, and they take it back to his father, and they let him assume that he had been killed by a wild animal. Bitterness, it's a lot like this beach ball, isn't it? I mean, no matter how you try, if you don't get rid of it, it will pop up and it will affect other people around you. And there is only one cure for bitterness, and it is forgiveness. Forgiveness is the only thing that lets the air out of the beach ball. Unless you do these things, you will stay angry. And it will fester in your heart. And it will turn you into somebody that you don't want to become. And it's just this. Number one, deal with it early. I don't know if there's any gardeners in here, but pulling a weed out whenever it's small is a heck of a lot easier than whenever it's full grown. And so is bitterness. When you deal with it early, that seed was planted early in their brothers' lives, and they had a choice. It's so much easier to forgive somebody before you let it fester. Ephesians 4:26 and 27 says, in your anger do not what? Sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. Do not give the devil a what? A foothold. That's what happens. If we don't deal with it early, the devil gets a foothold in our hearts. Deal with it early. Begin the work of forgiveness early before it begins to set in your heart. And I mean that when I say do the work of forgiveness, because it is not easy, is it? We have a standard for our leadership team here, for our elders and for our deacons and for our staff. And one of the standards is assume the best in people. Assume the best in people. Start by assuming that they have a good reason for what they do. If they're late to the meeting, sometimes we want to say, well, they always do that. They're always behind. They don't have their stuff together. But sometimes it can go a lot better for us in our lives and our relationships if we start with assuming the best. And we ask, oh man, what happened? Is there, they must have had a good reason. And let them prove you wrong. But I promise you, things will go so much better for you in your marriage, at work, in your neighborhood, at play, if you just assume the best in people. But the second thing is this: hand bitterness over to God. And guys, I get it. I understand. That sounds so lame and cheesy and cliche. Hand it over to God, right? But here's what I mean by that. Now, let me just read the scripture. It's Romans 12:19. He says, do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. The question is, can you trust that God knows about it, that He hasn't forgotten about it, and that He is better equipped to deal with it than you are? That God is not asking you to extend revenge, that He will take care of it. Can you just allow God to be the one to take on that responsibility? And can you just move on? Man, that's tough, but that's key. The third one is this: force in love to force out bitterness. When Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, He said, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. Love your enemy. L-O-V-E, love. That is tough. That is I think, probably one of the hardest things that Jesus ever said. And I meant it whenever I said force in love, right? It's a choice before it's a feeling. You have to force it in. And whenever you force in love, bitterness cannot stay. Bitterness is forced out. It is impossible for bitterness and love to exist in the same space. Take these words seriously that Jesus said and actually pray for the person that you're bitter against. And see what happens to your own heart. Find a way. Now, this is really tough, guys. This is next level stuff. Find a way to speak positively about them. Nothing deals with your bitterness faster than finding ways to openly bless someone. Now, I understand. Somebody's going to say, you don't understand. They only harmed me. I want to tell you something. If all they did was just make you a stronger person, say that. Find a way. We can be grateful for anything in our lives, even if it was nothing other than just making us stronger. And when you do that, you are releasing the grip that they have and that bitterness has on you. And the last one is this: purge bitterness wisely. Proverbs 15:1 says, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. There was a New York Times article titled The Lost Art of the Unsent Angry Letter, and talked about writing those letters without sending them. It reminded me of President Lincoln, who would write those letters out and then he would burn them. He would not send them on. There was a little line in the article that I thought was great. It says this: sometimes we need to separate what needs to be said from what only needs to be felt. I think there's real wisdom in that. Let me tell one last story and then we'll be done. In 1921, there was a Swedish family, David and Svi Flood, and they were becoming missionaries and they were going to go to the Belgian Congo. And they went down there and they met another couple named the Ericksons. And together, those two families decided that they wanted to go into a part of the Belgian Congo that had never been reached by the gospel before. And so as they approached the village, the chief grew wary of them. He didn't know who they were, what they were there for, and so he wouldn't allow them access into the village. And so they built mud huts a half a mile away from the village. Well, they stayed out there, and malaria hit their camp trouble hit their camp real quick, and in fact, the Ericksons got so sick that they had to go back. They had to leave the Floods there, and they went back to the mission. And so the Floods are there, and they're trying to make their way and survive out there. And they had no contact with anybody from that village except for one little boy who would come out twice a week to bring them food. And Svi Flood said, if that's the only person that I get to have a conversation with, I'm going to try to lead him to Christ. And she did. She led that boy to Jesus. Well, after they were already sick, she got pregnant. And it was obviously a rough pregnancy out there in the wild, and she was weakened from her sickness, and she was a small lady already anyway. She was only 4 feet 8 inches tall, and she gave birth, and she gave birth after a long and hard birthing process, and she gave birth to little Anna, a daughter. But 17 days later, Svi Flood died. And at that moment, David Flood grabbed Anna, and he went back to the mission, and he turned his back on the village, and he gave Anna away to the Ericksons who were there trying to recover from malaria. And then he turned his back not only on the village, but his calling and to God. And he went back home to Sweden, and he turned his back on his faith, and he said he became an alcoholic. He eventually married again, had more kids, but he said he would not allow the name of God to be spoken in his home ever again because God had taken away everything from him. That's what he said. Well, back at the mission, little Anna was there with the Ericksons, but the Ericksons, they died from malaria. They never recovered. And so she was given away to another missionary couple, an American missionary couple. And they came home on furlough to America, and when they were home, they couldn't go back because they didn't have the right paperwork for Anna to get back into the Belgian Congo. So they stayed there, and they raised her in South Dakota. And they renamed her Aggie. And so Aggie grew up. She eventually married a minister who later became a president of a Bible college in Seattle, Washington. And one day she was living there, and she had always known of her mom and dad's failed mission there in the Belgian Congo. But she went out to go get her mail, and she opened the mailbox, and there was a Swedish Christian magazine in there. It was not addressed to her or anybody that she knew. She didn't know why it was in there. But she took it out, and she started to thumb through it anyway, and it wasn't in English, but she was looking through it, and she was stopped cold in her tracks when she saw a picture in there of a grave with the name Svi Flood, her mom. And so she obviously rushed to have this thing translated. And whenever she got it translated, the article told about a little boy that was converted, and that boy grew up, and he built a school in that village, and he converted the children to Christ, and they in turn converted their families to Christ, and even the chief of the village was even converted to Christ. And that article said that there was now 600 baptized believers in Jesus. She was ecstatic. Several years later, the college gifted her husband and her a trip to Sweden. Well, she knew that that's where her family was, and so she looked up her family, and she found her brothers and sisters. And she met with them, and of course, naturally, she asked about her dad, and they said he's not doing well. He's turned his back on God, and you can't say the name of God in his home because he says that God taken everything away from him. Whenever she walked into the room where her father was, she said, "Papa." And he turned around, and he knew who that was. And he said, "Anna, I'm sorry I gave you away." And he started crying. And Aggie said, "Papa, it's okay. God took care of me." And he stopped crying, and he said, "Do not say that name in my home, because God took away everything from me." Bitterness had overcome him. And she said, "No, Papa, let me tell you about what God did from your work there in the Belgian Congo." And he began to sob, and he repented, and he came back to the Lord after all those years. Now listen, the story didn't end there. Several years later, Aggie and her husband Dewey were in London for a worldwide evangelism conference. And they were sitting up there, or sitting in the crowd, and this man from the Belgian Congo got up to report what was happening in the Belgian Congo. And now there wasn't just 600 believers there. There was not even 6,000. There was more than 110,000 baptized believers in Jesus, and of which he was the leader of. And so she just had to find this guy and talk to him. And she knew that he would never know like who her parents were, but she had to ask. And so she went over there and she asked him. She said, "That was incredible. By any chance, would you know who David and Svi Flood are?" He said, "Yeah, I do. Because I'm the little boy." And it came full circle as that infant girl that had just been born had now met that little boy after all the work that God had done. Listen, God was doing something that nobody could have believed, but He did it through deep hurt and deep pain. It was more than what we call a curveball. It was tragedy. But through that hurt came life. And now with the eyes of eternity, David and Svi Flood, and Aggie, they would all do it again. Listen, your bitterness robs you of the peace of knowing that God is in control. We have a choice in what we do with our bitterness. Consider Jesus' last words as He hung on the cross. He says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." It's time to get rid of the bitterness. Guys, let it go. Do the work you need to do to let it go. Let me pray. Jesus, every single one of us has gone through hurt.